Hi, welcome to PODigal Sons, episode 4. I'm Ron Turpin, your host of PODigal Sons, the podcast in which we are covering the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. We also cover a wide range of Christian topics and also topics that affect humanity in general. As always, we are going to start with where we left off. We are going to be covering Genesis chapters 12 through 19 today. If you have not read those chapters yet, I would go ahead and read those chapters. It will just help to fully understand those chapters before we get into the podcast. And I also have some pre-show notes that I'd like to talk about. Just some things I wanted to cover real quickly. Number one, I had a very odd interaction with another very successful and very smart YouTuber, I must say, Professor Dave Explains. He insulted me several times. Used several different insults, and all I was doing was sort of challenging his notion that what he was saying about abiogenesis was factual. So this video that he made, the definitive guide to debunking creationists, part 2, which does cover abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is this theory or this concept that life comes from non-life. This is a very highly debated and highly researched field. I made a comment kind of saying like, hey, this is none of what you're saying is proven or really even close to being proven. And you can kind of tell by reading, he was very offended by that. I thought it was strange, number one, that an atheist wouldn't be careful to sort of portray atheism as rude, or as, having these behaviors associated with being rude. It's almost like it's very appropriate that somebody without God would behave that way. So I would think they would be more careful. But also that he would spend time on somebody that has hardly any subscribers. He has like 3.5 million subscribers. So it is a little odd that he sort of spent time going back and forth with me on this. It kind of makes me think that he does understand that what he's saying is a lot of it's just a weak theory, really, and there's really not a lot of science behind it. I would highly recommend to go watch his debate with James Tour, and you'll see that he does the same sort of tactic. James Tour spends a lot of time on the actual science, whereas Professor Dave is spending a majority of his time attacking James Tour, which I find to be a waste of his time, and it also makes Professor Dave look pretty bad. But you can kind of tell just by how many followers he has, sort of where the culture sits in America right now, and you can easily go see that abiogenesis has never been proven nor disproven, for that matter. So for me, that was a very odd interaction, but it was eye-opening, and I found it very interesting. So we'll probably do another podcast pretty soon, sort of covering that whole interaction, but also talking more and more about abiogenesis and getting into the science of that. I'm looking for anybody that wants to be a part of the podcast, whether that's covering topics like Catholicism and Protestantism or atheism and creationism. If you are interested, please drop me an email. You can send an email to podigalsons777@gmail.com, or you can send me a comment or text me if you have my number. I'd be more than willing to partner with anybody or just have any guests that would like to be on the show. So let me get into the actual content of what we're going to be talking today. And then I did want to talk about a few things before we get into the new part of this. I think I missed something on the flood and a connection with baptism. I do think that there is a connection there. Sort of like how there was a connection between the Eucharist and the tree of life. I think there's a connection between the baptism and going into water and coming out and having your sins sort of wiped away. In the same way the flood happened and all the sin of the world was wiped away. I think there's a bigger picture there with that connection. And then I want to talk briefly about this default setting of man having this default setting of evil. And I kind of looking back at episode 3, I wish I would have maybe went into that a little more, but I do think the question is, why aren't we just born with the Holy Spirit in us? Why are we born with this default setting? Why did God create us that way? And it goes back to what I was saying in episode 1, but God wants us to do this on our own and elects to follow him. God can't do everything for us. He can't just have us, he wants to really find out who is going to truly follow him and truly be in his kingdom. And he cannot just do it for us in a way that we would just be born like that. So we do have to want it for ourselves. And I think that's sort of a common misconception with many Christians. But it goes back to the simulation theory and what I talked about in episode 1 and the parable of the weeds, and sort of having us live out this life and really truly finding out who is going to answer the call. And I think if we were born with the Holy Spirit and born with these things, it would just be too easy. And there wouldn't really be anything that we needed to do. And it just cannot work that way. And God has to ultimately give us a choice, and that's where that comes from. And that's why we sort of have this default setting. And that's why we sort of revert back to that way of life without God, because it is ultimately a lot easier to live like that, sort of live in this society that really indulges pleasure, and everything is just all about yourself and what's ever best for yourself. It's hard to be selfless. It's hard to take up a cross. And so I think that's an interesting part of that. But also we covered the Nephilim, and I do think this is another theory, but I think the Nephilim might have possibly built the pyramids. I know that's a weird thing to say. I know the Egyptians, are credited with building the pyramids, but they still can't figure out how they quite did that. And I think the Nephilim, being this sort of superior group of human-like people, giants, I think it would make sense as that they would have played a part in that. Anyways, I'm going to have to wrap that up. We have to get started with Genesis, but I did want to kind of cover a couple of things that came to light after episode 3. But all right, let's get into chapter 12. So Abraham was 75 years old when God calls upon him. At the end of chapter 11, I didn't cover this, but it does mention later in Joshua that Abraham's fathers did not follow God. You can go find this in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2 and 3. But they did serve other gods. We're talking about Terah and Nahor. And so Abraham is getting sort of plucked out of that world. And he is getting out of that world at 75 years old. But he is coming from a culture that worshipped other gods. And we have to kind of know that going into this. At this point in time, this is post Tower of Babel. So everybody's sort of spread out. Everybody's sort of doing their own thing. There's really not a formal following of God. At this point in time, there's no collection of people that are following God in any sort of formal way. There's no like family of God yet. This is all just a scattering of people, and now we're down to one. We're back to one person. We had Noah and his family, but they didn't really truly start any type of priesthood or following or anything like that in a formal capacity. So we're sort of back to one person, being Abraham. So I'll sort of read how this opens up, but with this calling that God makes to Abraham. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from the land of your kinsfolk and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." And then this is a little song that he sings, but I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. and curse those who curse you, and all the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you. Very, very compelling statement, and we are going to get a lot more of that. But this part, all the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you, that did play out, and that's what we see today, in that a lot of people came from Abraham, not just Christians, not just Jews, and you have to also consider the entire Islamic world came from Abraham. So we do have a lot of people that descended from him, whether that's directly or as far as his lineage, and also finding blessing coming from that family, being in the family of God. That did play out, and that is a prophecy that 100%. I mean, just look around at the billions of Christians and billions of Muslims that sort of come out of Abraham. And we'll get more into that in a second. But Abraham had faith, and he left out from his country, and that's sort of, people always kind of praise Abraham for his faith, and that's what he's sort of known for. But this was not an easy thing to do. He left Haran and went into the land of Canaan. He took all of his possessions, all the people that were with him. His wife, Sarai, we're introduced to her. Well, it was mentioned in the previous chapter, but he takes his wife, Sarai, all the servants. This is a big group that he is taking, and he is sort of responsible for these people. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants, I will give this land. So now we have a promise about this land. And Abraham is going to spend more time with God than anyone else that we've seen so far. He is going to have conversations with God. We really haven't seen too much of that. Adam, Seth, Noah, Shem, all these people have not really had any sort of conversations that were recorded or anything really, in any type of extended sort of manner. So he's going to be the first one. They passed through Canaan into the sacred place, Shechem, and he builds an altar there. And yes, he says, to your descendants, I will give this land, not Abram. And in his name right now is Abram, so this is not Abraham yet. But to your descendants, I will give this land, is what is mentioned. So Abraham is not going to receive this land necessarily. It's going to be dedicated to his descendants. He went on to Bethel and built an altar, and there he invoked the Lord by name, which is another sort of way of saying he prayed to God. And then he went to Negeb. And now we're introduced into this famine. Anytime that we read about a famine in the Old Testament, it is a big deal. We will read more about famines, but a lot of people, starved to death. They were living in misery anytime there was a famine. We sort of take it for granted that we have access to food, and there are parts of the world that still struggle heavily with this, but just keep in mind that anytime there's a famine, it's not like we sort of think about a famine if that were to happen, because we could probably figure out a way to get past that. But in this world, they are really relying on God to help them here. We'll read about how people kind of go into slavery willingly to be able to get fed. This is something that happens in Genesis, and so we have to think even about slavery different when we think about how these famines affected people. They are a big deal, and slavery was sort of a way of survival in some respects. And I know that's tough to grasp, but it's different than the sort of slavery we think about, the more recent slavery that happened in America, or that was happening in America. These famines were very scary for people. And so Abraham God did not instruct him to do this, but this famine was so severe that they go down to Egypt. And you have to keep in mind, Abraham's responsible for all these people. Egypt had many more resources than he would have had. But he kind of goes and does this on his own. And we're sort of introduced to this sort of trick that happens, and we'll read about it here in a second. But basically what happens is, I'll just go ahead and read it. When the Egyptian, so he has his wife who's very beautiful. Sarai is very beautiful. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, she is his wife. They will kill me, but let you live. Please say, therefore, that you are my sister. So he plays this sort of trick on the Egyptians. And we have to think about the world that they're living in. This ancient world of brutality, survival, wickedness, domination, all these sort of aspects of things we don't really live with anymore as much, or are very, I would say, like they're kind of what's deciding a lot of these decisions that Abram makes and other people in the Bible. So we have to understand that he is fearful that they are going to kill him and take his wife. So he's doing something kind of very tactful, even though it's not necessarily anything God told him to do, and he's sort of taking it upon himself to do this. I think he's trying to do his best to survive and protect himself and really protect his wife. So, and also keep in mind, like Abram just met God, like just recently. So he might not have the best relationship with God yet. And that's something he's working on. But I can identify with this character who is sort of just now figuring out, and he's sort of doing what he knows, what he has seen work in the past. Remember, he didn't have God for 75 years. So he's sort of reverting back to that. And it's easy to do that. But his relationship with God is brand new. So a lot of people kind of focus on him not having faith here. And he is afraid, and that's why he does this. And that's true. But I sort of appreciate his cunningness here. And it's not right to lie, but we will find other instances of people lying in the Bible, and it sort of working in their favor. And one example of that would be the women who were nursing the Israelite women who had these babies, and they lied to Pharaoh about the babies because Pharaoh's trying to kill them. Anyways, I'm not going to skip ahead. I'm just saying that lying sometimes can be done for reasons that can sort of be justified in a way. And it's always not so black and white. But anyways, these people are just surviving, and it's easy to judge, but they are doing their best to survive, and he's not fully immersed into God yet. It ends up going per plan, and it ends up working. Now keep in mind, she is so beautiful that not only do the Egyptians recognize this, but they bring her to Pharaoh, which is a big deal. And they bless Abraham with flocks and herds and servants and camels. And so, yes, he is getting blessed here after this lie happens, which is interesting. But Pharaoh is sort of in constant trouble with God, and God has no problem. I would say, like, letting a trick work on Pharaoh. So I don't think that God has that much of an issue with this lie. So God keeps Pharaoh from advancing on Sarai, and his household is struck with plagues. And God has no problem doing this. It's definitely not the first plague that is going to happen. But Pharaoh summoned Abram and said to him, how could you do this to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Then here then is your wife. Take her and be gone. So Abram got to keep all the stuff. Pharaoh sends her away. Now I appreciate his smarts here, and yes, it's not, people look down on him for this, but I understand sort of. I kind of resonate where he's coming from. He, like I said earlier, he's just doing the best he can, and it works out. And he answered the original call to God, and God rewards him for sort of taking him up on it. He doesn't want to like be so harsh on Abram so quickly. And even though Abram doesn't do everything right, God is still with this person, and God is still going to be there for him and support him. So that's why he does this to Pharaoh, and that's why he sends this plagues, because he wants Abram to be successful. Okay, so that was chapter 12. Let's get into chapter 13. So they all go back to the place between Bethel and Ai, where he had first built an altar. Abram at this point was rich, and also he has Lot with him, who has many possessions, to the point where they couldn't really dwell together. And what was happening really was Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen were getting into it, and they were quarreling, as it says, and they were disagreeing about which land was dedicated for which group of flocks or whatever it might have been. And this is interesting, and we'll uncover more about what's going on here. But Abram is the one that initiates peace in this, and it reminds me of Christ. It's giving Christ, but he, making amends with your brother and friends before it turns into an issue, is very much is something that Christ preaches. And he says, Lot, if you want to go left, I'll go right, and if you want to go right, I'll go left. And he's sort of also in a way kind of like, whatever you want to do, we just can't be fighting like this. But he puts Lot first, which is exactly how Jesus sort of calls us to act. And we put others before ourselves, whatever needs to happen to make peace. And so Lot decided to go to Sodom because it was fertile at this time. They were able to grow a lot of whatever they needed. They were able to have harvest and grow food and whatever. So that's how he's seeing it. But he didn't take into account how sinful Sodom was, and he did not care. And anytime Lot is brought up, there's going to be trouble, sort of, or something's not, Lot is sort of a troubled character, and we'll read more about that. But he goes ahead and goes to Sodom. Meanwhile, Abram is looking around, and God says, look around, all this land you see, I will give to your descendants forever. So again, just another promise by God. And this is kind of the first mention of how many descendants he will have, which God makes a comparison here to the dust of the earth, which you could never really count the individual dust pieces of the earth. And in the same way, the descendants of Abram, it's impossible really to count. And that fully played out. Just look around at the Jewish people, and then the people that turned into Christians, and even you have to even look at the Islamic people, like I said earlier, because that's all a part of this story. But Abram moves his tent to Hebron, and this is sort of where we end. So that was chapter 13. In chapter 14 gets very interesting, and we're into the days of Amraphel, and we'll kind of just summarize what's going on here. But you have these three different kings. You have Arioch, Shedar. Sorry, I knew how to say this earlier, and I'm forgetting. But Shedar Lamer is what we'll say, and then title. We'll just call him King Shed. All right, or Ched, King Ched. I'm not the best with names, guys. I'm gonna do the best, but just we can understand what's happening. And so you have these three kings, and they made war against Bera, Bersha, Shinab, Shemeber, Bela, and they were subjected because before that, King Ched was subjecting them for 12 years. So in the 13th year, all these other kings, the king of Sodom, Bera, the king of Gomorrah, Bersha, and these other kings, they all rebelled against this. And in the 14th year, King Ched defeated them. And so the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, you had 3 against 4 in this valley. And these kings had fell into you'll read about these bitumen pits. Anytime you see bitumen, just put tar in there, because it's pretty much what it is, just a big tar pit. The kings had fell into this. I mean, they lost to King Ched in a bad way. And when that happened, the kings of Sodom, when they fell to this king, the victors had seized all the possessions, and Lot was included in that. So King Ched had pretty much took all this stuff out of Sodom, and including the people, and Lot was in there. And one of the fugitives tells Abram this. He's called a Hebrew here. First time we see that, he's called a Hebrew. And when Abram heard about this, he gets fired up, and he gathers 318 men. Anybody that was born in his house is how it's put. So really, born in his house doesn't mean his actual home, although I guess it could have meant, but it's really just in his direct location, in the buildings that he was in control over, in the tents, everything in the area that Abram was in control over. And so they pursued King Ched, and as far as north of Damascus, and we'll maybe bring up kind of where that is, but they recovered all the possessions, and he defeated this king, which was a big deal. I mean, he defeated a king who had defeated other kings. So this is the first instance of God being on the side of his people and helping. And I do believe God helped here. We don't really see that directly, but it's going to happen a lot more. But Abram defeated this guy, and the king of Sodom, who possibly climbed out of the pit, I guess, was happy to see Abram, and he sort of comes and greets him. So we're at this moment, Abram had just defeated this king in a big way, and we're going to get some sort of praises by these two individuals, one being the king of Sodom, the other being a very interesting character called Melchizedek. So I'll have to go into Melchizedek because he's brought up later in the Bible, and it is a interesting part of this. But Melchizedek, king of Salem. So Salem eventually turns and Salem means peace, but that eventually turns into Jerusalem. So Jerusalem. And we know this if you go read, Hebrews chapter 7, 1 through 3. But his name means king of righteousness. And Melchizedek's name means king of righteousness. But he blesses him. Melchizedek blesses Abram with wine and bread. Melchizedek is a king, a priest of the God Most High, and he's really the only person outside of Abram that is following God, and he kind of comes out of nowhere, right? Because nobody else is doing this. And that's why there's a connection between Melchizedek and Jesus. He's a priest and a king like Jesus. I have to shout out to Pastor Paul at Calvary Chapel because I learned a lot of this from him, but there's no record of his genealogy. You can go look at Psalm 110. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So when we talk about the order of Melchizedek, sort of meaning that he came out of nowhere, because Jesus was not and this is where it makes that connection in Hebrews, but Melchizedek resembles the Son of God because Jesus didn't come from the priestly line of Aaron, which we'll read about in Exodus. He kind of came out of his own, and Melchizedek sort of does the same thing. So it's not like Melchizedek is this angelic figure, the spiritual figure or anything, but he does sort of make an appearance out of nowhere, and he does relate to Christ in that way. So understanding Melchizedek, we do have to sort of skip forward, but it is very interesting because there is no formal sort of following of God at this point, but it does exist, and Melchizedek is blessing him. We'll go ahead and read it, but blessed be Abraham by God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your foes into your hand. So really cool little song that he sings. Then Abram honors and he gives them a tenth of everything he has, not just a tenth of like the money he had that day or anything, like a tenth of all of his stuff, which is like the formal sort of tithe that gets installed. And that's sort of the same thing we follow, and we're sort of seeing the first tithe here. And it is just an interesting interaction that we sort of had to really explain. But anyway, so King of Sodom comes back into the story, and it's a way different interaction here. But Abram says, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High that he would not take anything from Sodom, and he did not want to accept anything from him because he didn't want to be associated with this king of Sodom, and he didn't want to feel like he owed him anything. He shares openly his dependence on the Lord and not these people that are trying to like have one up on him and sort of be in a position that is saying, you know, I gave you this, or I let you have this. But really, Abram refuses to take the possessions. So what the king of Sodom is trying to say is, you know, give me the people and you can keep the possessions. But Abram doesn't want to feel like he owes him anything. So he says, no, I'm not going to take the possessions. And, you know, you're not going to keep the people that I have with me. So in a way, he's like denying this king. And it is something that is important because we do feel like, you know, the world is always trying to give us something, and we're trying to give up our allegiance to God for that. And we do have to deny that when it comes around. And there's numerous examples of how that can happen. But if somebody's trying to give you money for something that is dishonest, you have to turn that down. And that's what's happening here. Okay, well, that was chapter 14. So now we get into chapter 15 and this covenant with Abram. God was happy, you know, for Abram not getting into the dealings with the king of Sodom. You know, he was happy with Abram for this. And God said, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. I will make your reward very great. And Abram is not afraid to fire back at God if he feels like he needs to. If he's not happy, Abram will make it known. But Abram's like, what reward? You know, there's still they don't have any children at this point, him and Sarai, and Abram is kind of lamenting to God here, and he doesn't like this situation he's in, and he's sort of like, what reward? You know, all I have right now is for my heir is my servant Eliezer, and I can't have all these descendants and all this stuff if I don't have a true heir. And God says, you know, no, that's not how, you know, your heir is not going to be the servant. Go look into the stars, and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And this is interesting because Abram, even though he's very faithful, he doesn't just take God's word for it. And he says something very interesting, but Abram says, really, he goes, how am I really going to know this is real? And the way that he asked this is, O Lord God, he asked, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And God then goes on to say, bring me a heifer, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, 3-year-old she-goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and all these animals, turtle dove, young pigeon. And we are about to have to talk about this and why this happens. But basically, all these animals get cut in half. Very graphic sort of thing to think about. And why does this happen? That's probably a question you're asking, is like, why do animals have to die? Because if God is going to make a promise here, and these animals would have died in vain if God doesn't keep his promise, or if Abraham doesn't keep his promise. And this is just how these things happen in the ancient world. Ultimately, like we talked about animal sacrifice in the last episode, but ultimately Christ comes in and we don't have to do that anymore. But in the ancient world, you wouldn't accept anything. There wouldn't be like a written contract. Like, this is the contract. And if these animals can't just die in vain, they have to die for a purpose. And so their death would be meaningless. And everything about that person who made that pact would, disgrace would fall on that person. And there's a reference to Jeremiah, but if anybody disagrees, or if anybody doesn't hold up their end on the agreement, then they themselves would end up like the animals. So it is very much something that people will see, and it will stay with them the rest of their lives. It had to be like something very firm and something that you couldn't go back on. So this is why this happens. And like I mentioned, like, it's just a part of this ancient world and these ancient customs. But really what happens is, so you have all these animals. Abram stayed with the carcasses, and a trance fell upon him. And then God gives here a prophecy of what happens in Exodus. Talks about how, his descendants shall be aliens in a land that's not their own, and they'll be oppressed for 400 years, which is exactly what happens in Exodus. He talks about how the wickedness of the Amorites will grow, and then the sunset, and then there was what is called a brazier, which is like an oven, and a flaming torch. I guess they're floating. I guess you could think about it like that, but it passes through the pieces of these animals, and the covenant was cemented at that point, and it was the presence of God. And that is the covenant sort of fully lived out in a very real way. And this is what sort of cements that covenant. So yeah, I know it's tough to understand why these animals have to die, but in all aspects, it is just a way to make this serious and not have these animals die in vain. They died for a purpose, and it was a greater purpose. And this will be a continual theme. And God is not afraid to sacrifice his own son. So these animals are just a small part of this thing. So that was chapter 15. We get into chapter 16. Anytime there's a covenant, it's sort of followed by this like test that happens. The Noah had this covenant, and then what happened? You had this issue with Ham. Abraham had a covenant originally, and then you had this issue with Pharaoh. Well, now we just had a new, like a true covenant, and we're about to get into another issue. And one thing I want to touch on is this continual theme of sexual immorality that happens. And we are just at the beginning, and we have already read about this in so many ways. And this is a continual thing. And this book is really about family and unity between man and wife, and how that should be done. And that's not the only thing, but it is a big part of it. And I don't think people realize how big of a part of it is. But we think about what happened with Lamech taking 2 wives, and Lamech sort of being the first person that causes this full fall into sin that pushed the world. He was just an example of it, but that is why the world ends up getting flooded out. Is one of those reasons is Lamech takes it upon himself to take 2 wives. So you have sexual immorality there. You have God's angels falling to the lust of these new women that he created. So you have another example of this issue. You have Ham's issue with Noah and his wife. So you just are having so many of these problems that are coming from this thing. And now we're about to find another issue, and it doesn't stop here, even in this portion of what we're covering today. This is just one example, but this book talks, this is trying to tell us how we need to live. And I think Abraham was doing his best and staying faithful to Sarai, and that's why he was picked originally. But we do see sort of a stumble here. But it's not the only lesson that we learn from the Bible, and that's not my point. But my point is that it is a big lesson, and it is something we have to pay attention to as it comes up. So Sarai hadn't born any children yet, and this is very sad. And this is something that affects people to this day. But back then, it was like you were almost like cursed if you were like not able to produce children. And it was, like I said in the last episode, it was what drove everybody. It was a big part of the ancient world to have children and procreate. And it's still a big thing today, but it was sort of what made you in that day, and what really made you successful was your ability to pass on your genes to the next. And it's the same thing that sort of controls biology. And it's this book is it's interesting that people don't make that connection with evolution and biology and what this Bible is doing, because it's correcting this whole issue. But anyway, so they had this Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and Sarai gets the idea to give Hagar to Abram to make offspring with him. It's important to note that Sarai doesn't have the same faith as Abram. They followed other gods. And I'll go ahead and make a movie recommendation. I would highly recommend to watch His Only Son. I wouldn't watch it yet. I would wait until you finish the portion of Abram, but it is important. And I want to say, because that movie does sort of really give you a lot of good imagery and kind of puts you back into that time, and kind of, it helps you to become immersed. And that's why I recommend movies, because you'll never really forget kind of what happens here. Anyway, so she gets pregnant. Hagar gets pregnant, and Abraham doesn't really put up a fight. We can kind of tell that, but Abraham, he also wants an heir, and he has his own reasons for doing this, and it's not correct. And this isn't anything that God is doing. This is all on them. This is them kind of going their own way, the same way they went to Egypt. But she does get pregnant, and what Hagar is kind of doing, and how you can interpret this, but she kind of starts gloating about it. So she became pregnant, and when she became aware of her pregnancy, she looked down on her mistress with disdain. So Sarai said to Abram, "You're responsible for this outrage against me. I myself gave my maid to your embrace, but ever since she became aware of her pregnancy, she has been looking down on me with disdain." So she had this idea, and it didn't turn out the way she thought. And I think she was just... this is typical human behavior, and she blames Abram, but we think we have this solution in our head, and maybe she's kind of baiting Abram here. I don't know, but it ends up being a terrible thing for this household. But Abram says, "Hey, like, she's still in your power." And then so Abram says that, like, "Hey, she's still in your power," and Sarai ends up abusing this power, and to the point where she abuses Hagar and is very mean to Hagar, and this pushes her away. So the a Lord's messenger, which I guess we could think about as an angel, finds Hagar and tells her to go back. And it's an interesting part of this that I'll go ahead and read it. But the Lord's messenger told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her abusive treatment. I will make your descendants so numerous," added the Lord's messenger, "that they will be too many to count." So she's getting sort of the same covenant as Abram in a way. And these descendants are going to be numerous. And he even sings her a little song here. "You are now pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord God has heard you. God has answered you. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. In opposition to all his kin shall he encamp." So this right here is the birth of the Islamic religion. And in many ways, we can see this play out. And we see many examples of war sort of just enveloping these people. And so this prophecy really, it came to life. All these prophecies are coming to life. And it's so hard for me when a skeptic can't see that, because, I mean, all these things, came true. But she gives him a name, the God of Vision. So in the ancient world, and she came from Egypt, and if you had ever seen God, you were supposed to die, but she was able to see God and remain alive. So she gives God this name. You are a God of Vision. Bir Leharoi is what she says. Or that's the well that it's called, where this happened. But it's interesting how these people came from this. But so Abram was 86 at the time that this happened, and that was chapter 16. So we're now in chapter 17. Abram is 99 years old. This is 13 years after Ishmael is born, and he's getting really old. And so the Lord God appeared to him again. He says, "I am God Almighty. Walk in my presence." And then he brings up the covenant again. And he gives Abram a new name. So now we can stop finally calling him Abram and call him Abraham. It's interesting that Ham is in there. I don't know why the Ham is added. Not sure, but it's just interesting. Anyways, this is a common theme in the Bible. So anytime anybody's given a new name, that's a special occurrence, and they're sort of in a way, kind of like they have a new identity, a new sort of mission in life. And Abraham, and God says, "I will never leave your descendants" as well. So not only is he making a promise to Abraham, but he's saying, "I will never leave your descendants either." Really, we're talking about the Jewish people. But if you go to verse 5-7, we'll just kind of read that real quick. But no longer shall you be called Abram, your name shall be Abraham, for I am making you the father of a host of nations. I will render you exceedingly fertile. I will make nations of you. Kings shall stem from you. I will maintain my covenant with you and your descendants after you throughout the ages as an everlasting pact to your God and the God of your descendants after you. And then he goes on to give them the land, to promise the land to his descendants. So now we see this covenant is going to sort of start coming to life eventually. But we need something to make that happen, not just with Abraham, but with all of his descendants. So we need this sort of thing that identifies that. And very tough subject, but I'm happy to get into it. But basically, he calls on Abraham to circumcise himself and everybody in this covenant throughout the ages. So that's why it's done, is because it's not just identifying Abraham, it's identifying every single male born from there on in to his household. He has this done as they're 8 years old, or 8 days, sorry. When they're 8 days old, he has this, which is actually the optimal time for blood clotting, which, science and doctors have figured that out. But it's interesting that God knows what's best for us. I mean, this was a custom way before, science and medical research became popular. One sec. All right. Sorry about that. So So let's talk about circumcision and why this happens. Why not like a cut in the ear or something, right? And that's how I've always thought. Like, couldn't he have made something easier to do? Why did he have to do this? Why make it weird? It's a very good question, but it makes sense because it is the most intimate part of a man, and it is not easy to part with, that part of yourself. Um, but the thing is, it does have to be a hard thing to do because you are now a part of God's family, and in order to do that, you can't just do something that would be easy. It does have to be hard, and that's a continual theme of the Bible, and that this path is not easy, and it goes back to trying to find out, who is really going to follow Him. And people could easily just say, okay, I'm going to be in this family of God now. People that were to come into it, which we'll see that. But they don't make it easy. And you're not just going to kind of be able to say you're in the family of God. You have to do something, which is circumcise yourself, which is not an easy thing to do for people. And that is why it's in here, because, people are not going to join if they are really not bought into God. The only way to really be bought into God is to do that. So it weeds out people that are not serious. And it took me a long time to understand, why do we do the circumcision? But when you think about it like that, it makes a lot of sense. And what I said earlier in the beginning about this theme of sexual misconduct and why it's hard for these men to part with this thing, with this part of themselves. And we know this will be a problem, and it will continue being a problem, and we have to find out who's serious. So circumcision is a way for I understand it as a way for God to sort of weed out the people who aren't serious, and every male in his household and the servants as well are going to have this done. And so Abraham got a new name. Sarai gets a new name. She's now called Sarah, and she will be blessed. I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her. Him also I will bless. He will give rise to nations and rulers of people. We're talking about Isaac here. And he kind of like laughs at this, and he's like, can a child be born to a man who is 100, or Sarah who's 90? He laughs and tells him that the son of God will be Isaac. Sorry, guys, my kids are being loud. Okay. But so tells him there we have a son called Isaac, and he will bless, Ishmael is also going to have a covenant. Or sorry, Ishmael is also going to be blessed, but Isaac is the one who's going to keep this covenant with God. So Isaac is sort of separated from Ishmael at this time. But he actually gives a specific indication of when this is going to happen, which is this time next year, he says. So now he's starting to say, like, get ready. This is serious. This is going to happen. And I don't think they're taking it quite seriously yet. And Abraham sort of like snarks at this, but I think it's more of a way, and Pastor Paul explained this really well, but it's more of a way of like, Abraham's like, really? Like, okay. Well, we'll see, kind of. Like, I think that's more of what's like. It's not really doubt as much as it is just like kind of like surprise. But Abraham doesn't waste any time on the circumcision. It shows how faithful he is. He does it the same day. He's like, I'm down. Like, let's do this. It's a weird thing to do immediately, but he does it anyways. He has great faith here, and he doesn't waste any time. And everyone in his household does it. So it must have just been a bittersweet day, I guess you could say, but mostly sweet in that he's getting this covenant with God. It is just a interesting concept, circumcision. It took me a long time, especially as a man, to understand why that's done. But when we think about how we've already read about so much sexual misconduct and stuff, it does make sense that that would be something you have to part with, that piece of yourself, and it is intimate. And the God of the Old Testament he doesn't play around, and this isn't like, he doesn't walk on eggshells with these people. And we have this, when we read this, we read about it in this from the perspective of this comfort world that we live in. but go camping for 2 years and don't come into society, and then I think you'd probably have a different perspective. But anyways, so that was chapter 17. We get into chapter 18. And then the Lord appears. When we think about the Lord here, really what I view this as is Jesus. And Jesus, before he was born into be, Jesus existed as a spiritual being, and also could appear as man, but it's different than whenever Jesus comes down on earth fully as man. It's different than here, which is he's appearing to Abram, and was probably appearing to him the whole time. But these two men are actually angels, which that gets uncovered very quickly. But Abram wants to bathe their feet, which is more foreshadowing of Christ. It's kind of the first time we see about this custom of bathing feet, which in the old days, when you're walking around continually, even if you have sandals or whatever, your feet would get dirty. Even us, our feet get dirty even when we're not walking out in the desert for months on end, but their feet were dirty. So having clean feet, is important. And so that's why that's in that custom. But Abram insists that they rest and have food, and they let him do this. Jesus and the two angels kind of let him do this, even though they don't really need it. And he tells Sarah to hurry up and make rolls, and we had people over, let's get this going. And he has a whole cow prepared, and they're probably in there just making all this happen. He asks Sarah. He asks for Sarah and says, and God and the Lord, says to Sarah, by this time next year she will have a son. And Sarah laughs, and she's basically like, how am I going to be, this old and have a son? How am I going to have pleasure? Is basically what she says. When that part of herself, she thinks is over. She doesn't have her, menstrual cycle the same. And there's other examples, but Sarah, her faith is not like Abraham's. And the Lord calls her out, very bluntly, why is she laughing? And it's different from Abraham's laugh, I think, because, and shout out to Pastor Paul again, he explained this well, but he knows her heart. Talking about God knows her heart right here. He knows that Abraham might have been laughing in a different way, but and we understand that well as humans. Somebody could laugh in just a certain slight way that another person laughs could be way different, even though they're laughing about the same thing. One could be laughing in a way of oh, that's interesting, that's going to happen. We'll see how that works. And then the other one could be laughing in no, there, yeah, right, kind of a way. So 1 second. So there's two different ways that this is Abraham's laugh's different than Sarah's laugh. But one thing that's said here is, is anything too marvelous for the Lord to do? And that's an interesting thing that's said here, because it's a key passage, but it goes back to creationism, in that the Lord can do anything. And people when they don't accept creationism as a valid means of the origin of the universe, they also don't get to fully accept the power of God. And that's why you can't have one without the other. And that's why we did the episode 1, because with creationism, all things are possible, and anybody can get, whatever needs to happen for God's will happen. But it's a funny interaction here, and it's kind of sounds like how we kind of talk today. But she gets scared after this, and she says I didn't laugh. And God's like, yes, you did. And God knows her heart. And so it's just interesting that it ends that way with that interaction. But she's probably oh, wow, that was different. He just kind of being called out. But anyway, so they go down to Sodom, and the Lord, which, yes, I think this is Christ, he's going to reflect right here and say, like, should I hide what I'm about to do with these people of Sodom? Because if Abraham doesn't understand what he's about to do, I think that Abraham could go in a different direction with it, and it might not be very clear and with why Sodom has to get destroyed. And I could see why the Lord is struggling right here, because he's wondering, is Abraham going to be able to determine what is right and what is just after he sees this happen? Is he going to be sort of questioning now? I think that's kind of where this is coming from. But what if he doesn't understand the process by which he's going to get rid of evil? But we read about how the outcry is so great. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grave. Whether or not their actions fully correspond to the cry against them that comes to me, I mean to find out. So these people are hurting in this place, and that's what this outcry is these people are suffering, and they're trying to cry out to somebody to help them. Whatever might be happening here, torture, forced assault, and in terrible ways, murder, amongst others. I mean, we will kind of see what's happening, but we don't know the full extent of what's happening. But we can only imagine that it's a terrible thing. So Abraham and the Lord are going to have a conversation here. And this is why Abraham is so important, because he is the first person to really talk with God and sort of question God. And it's an important part of Genesis. And it's important to the question that we talked about in episode 1, and we continually talk about, but why does God allow evil? And the answer is that he doesn't really truly allow evil. He allows choices, and we make bad choices, and then now God has to deal with it. So they do this back and forth, and really how it starts, and what Abraham is questioning is, suppose, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? Suppose there were 50 innocent people in the city. Would you wipe out the place rather than spare it for the sake of 50 innocent people? So this is the exact question that a lot of skeptics have about many aspects of the Bible. Why did God flood the world? Why did he command the Amalekites to be slaughtered? Why did he do this? Why did he do that? But we get this answer right here, and it sort of sets a standard moving forward for why God does these things, because they're evil, and he doesn't allow evil to go on without consequences. And it's pretty simple, really. But they start with 50, and and then Abraham sort of brings it down to 45, and then it sort of just continually goes, down to 30 people, going to 40, and then the 30, all the way down to 10. And Abraham is sort of careful, not to anger the Lord, but God is very willing to sort of call on and play Abraham's game and say, okay, yeah, if there are 10 righteous people there, I won't destroy the city. He sort of makes a promise here, and they depart. But it's very interesting how that whole conversation went down, because as we come to find out, there's 0 righteous people in Sodom. So that was chapter 18. So we began with chapter 19, and the 2 angels go down to Sodom. Lot is already at the gate, and they see them, and he bows down to them, and he urges them to spend the night in his house instead of spending the night in the town square, which is what they wanted to do originally, because Lot knows how bad it is, and he knows that they can't spend the night in the town square. But before they went to bed, all the townsmen of Sodom, so all the people down to the last man is what it says. And what did Abraham and the Lord just talk about? If there were any people that weren't that were righteous, they would spare it. Well, we just find out quickly that that literally all the people are coming down to try to do these evil things. And they all close in on Lot, and they want to have these forced relations with these angels, which is weird. And, first off, just like how gross is that? But I mean, we've sort of see this theme of immorality that is just plaguing these early people in this time. And it's a behavior that is lust driven. And it's a slippery slope, and it's just a behavior that is born out of this aspect of domination, and it's just an evil behavior. And it's something that, we see here is just is just a sign of a society that is not really doing the right thing. But Lot, who is troubled already, has this, which is every time Lot's mentioned, has this issue. He has some sort of issue, but he offers up his daughters, which is also just terrible when we read about it. But we do have to understand, I guess, the culture of the time, and that if you had anybody in the protection of your household, you were 100% responsible for them. To me, I don't really see how that excuses anything. But these are also angels. These are the Lord's men. But Lot does make another mistake here. I mean, it was his mistake to go live in Sodom to begin with, and now he's just trying to do anything he can to correct this situation. I don't think he really knows what to do, and he's just he's trying to correct already a bad situation with a terrible solution. But it's an excuse, and Lot and his wife as well don't really know how to deal with anything correctly in this Bible. Lot doesn't, never has a good solution. But next, the people say that they're, Lot tried to solve it with this, and the people, aren't having it. And they say, stand back, this fellow, they sneered, came here as an immigrant, and now he gives us orders. We'll treat you worse than them. So, they're going to force themselves on Lot, even worse than they want to do the angels. And so they start pressing on the door, and the angels at this point have had enough. And I think they, they could have easily dealt with it whenever, but I think they're trying to see kind of what these people are like. And they fully understand now. They were trying to force themselves sexually on these angels, and the angels were like, we're not going to have any of this. And so they pull Lot inside, and they're like, Lot, you tried, you're done. And they use this blinding light, almost like a flashbang in a way, which is really cool to think about. It's almost like a superpower or something. But it's so blinding, and these people can't find the door. So we see this all go down. It's very much like a scene from a movie. But these angels ask Lot to go after they do this, after they flashbang these people, and they ask Lot and all the people to get out of there, because they're about to nuke this place. And Lot goes in, tries to get them. Lot tries to get all of his people out, but all of his people think that he's joking. And the reason they think he's joking is because they're sort of so numb to this sort of thing that they don't really understand what's wrong. They're just like, oh, people are screaming and people are trying to do this terrible thing. I mean, they probably just think it's normal. And they kind of grew up in this. But these people are taking so long to get out that the angels have to literally bring them out by hand. And the angels are really trying to save these people. And they tell them to flee for their lives. Don't look back is a command that they give them. And then Lot sort of tries to negotiate to which city they need to go to. And I think they're like, whatever, just go to the city you want. You just need to get out. And then the Lord rains down sulfur and fire, which that must have been, a sight to see that. And it wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like all the neighboring cities. It was the whole plain. It was the tar pits. That the tar pits are just fuel there, and they probably exploded as well. But Lot's wife looks back, and when we think about looking back, it's not like she just looks back just like to see what happened. She is having this sort of resentment about leaving, is how it's sort of interpreted. And she like wants to go back, and she like misses and she doesn't want that to happen to her city, and she's sort of sad to see this happen to her city. And that's really what's going on here. And we know this because it's mentioned in Luke. Christ even talks about Lot's wife in Luke 17:28 through 32, and how if you're still sort of obsessed with these worldly possessions, when the Son of Man calls on you, you're going to sort of be in the same position as Lot's wife. So very, very interesting what's going on here. And Abraham sees all this happen, sees everything that happens. And it's noted that, God was mindful of Abraham and his feelings for Lot. And that's really probably the only reason that Lot got to survive. And so the few people that God wanted to save, he did take out of there. And then Lot, again, afraid to live in this new city, Zoar. Lot has a lot of issues, and he's never mentioned without some type of controversy, but he lived in a cave with his two daughters. The two daughters are growing up. We have to keep in mind they grew up in Sodom, and that's what they're used to, is this world of all these crazy immoralities that happen. And they probably remember, Lot wanting to give them up to these men. So they are probably numb to any sort of any sort of immorality. They just, and they're not really, they don't really care. But they force Lot to get drunk, and they lay with him, and they have children. Yes, I mean, this is very gross, but this is very looked down upon. And these children that they have, Moab and Ammon, they become the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, who will be continual enemies of Israel. So again, we had the issue with Ham, and the Canaanites sort of come out of that. And now we have another issue with this sexual immorality, and it's a continual theme. But we have the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all these people sort of born out of this unholiness are going to have this continual issues, and they'll be outcasted from Israel due to them living in sin. So yeah, I mean, that was a lot, and there's a lot of tough things to read about, but it's giving us insight into how we should live our lives. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed our time together, and look forward to doing next week. Next week we'll do chapters 20 through 27. So Genesis chapters 20 through 27. I love you guys and look forward to seeing you. Bye.